So moving on to the next section of deficits and debt. All right, so fiscal years begin on October 1st and end on September 30th. So looking at this, the Obama fiscal years on this chart are 2015, 2016, and 2017. President Trump actually took office in January of 2017, but the fiscal year started back on October 1st of 2016. And so we were basically 4 months into the fiscal year with most of the spending decisions made before President Trump took office. Likewise, the President Trump budget years, fiscal years, were 2018 to 2021, and we see that we continued to have increases in the budget deficit during the first couple of Trump years, even before we got to the pandemic. Before the pandemic hit, we were projected to go over a $1 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2020. We actually went over a $3 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2020, primarily because of the CARES Act, all the people that lost their job, the lower taxes, all the economic stabilizers that kicked in that recession. And so the next year, the 2.8 trillion in fiscal year 2021 is actually a Trump budget deficit. Then we see a drop down to the Biden budget deficits, which continued to grow. A lot of that had to do with trying to do student loan forgiveness without Congress. And the next slide kind of shows that a little bit, where we see that the deficits went down under Biden, but part of that was artificial because he tried to cancel a lot of student loans that the courts, and so things that were deficits in an earlier year were added back in a later year. Interestingly, the individual income taxes went down in fiscal year 2023. David, do you know why that is? I'm not that familiar with that particular.
I don't know the details on that one.
Could be that, the stock markets didn't perform well in 2022, so there was a lot less capital gains reported on individual income taxes. Would be at least a substantial portion of that. And we look at spending. In the next slide, what we see, again, spending went up between 2022 to down slightly in 2023, up again in 2024. And I think part of that was the student loan forgiveness that didn't happen, but was counted against fiscal year 2022, and then added as a negative in fiscal year 2023. And the budget deficit forecast, what we see here, interestingly, this assumes that there are no changes to current law, that the Trump tax cuts from 2017 expire and are not renewed. And so what we see is that the projection from the Congressional Budget Office, if there are no changes, is the deficit will actually come down a little bit in the first Trump years, fiscal years 2026, 2027, and then go back up after that. The reality is that Trump has promised that he will extend all of the tax cuts and add a whole bunch more. And so we're going to explode the deficit well beyond what's shown on this chart. This is don't be scared by the national debt. Household net worth is multiples of the national debt. And so the country and the households are not bankrupt. And I'll let David pick up with the household financial positions and move on from here. But first off, are there any questions on the deficits and debt that we just went over?
Hey, Karl. Musk says that he is going to eliminate $2 trillion from the U.S. budget through cuts by reorganizing the government. Is that even possible?
Well, again, they're planning to cut a lot of Medicaid and food stamp benefits. And if you do major cuts there, you might get $500 billion. If they cut defense spending significantly, Trump has promised not to cut Medicare or Social Security, but I don't know whether he's going to keep those promises, because those are the big ticket items where you could find that kind of money to cut.
One of the best opportunities to cut the deficit is to get interest rates down towards zero. If you look at the bottom of this chart, the net interest on the debt has gone up dramatically because of higher interest rates. If you get those interest rates back down towards zero, that debt number is going to start, that interest amount is going to go way down. When you hear about Trump putting pressure on the Fed, he's going to need those interest rates down because he's going to slow the economy with his tariffs and the immigration restriction. That is something that he'll get. Now, bear in mind that interest on the public debt is money going to investors, meaning it's money going into the private sector for the most part. About a third of that of our debt is owned by foreigners. So that interest goes overseas, but a lot of that is actual stimulus money. It's going to people and then they spend it, but the bondholders tend to be, they could be, well, if they're individuals, they'll be richer individuals, but a lot of our mutual funds, that we invest in have that money too. And so it's going in there. So a lot of us are enjoying the nice dividend yields or interest payments that we're getting, but it's not everyone. But that is one way to do it. But it's the big stuff. I forget who said it. We're basically an elderly insurance company with an army. I forget who said that. But it's to a certain extent, it's true. Like if you got to cut one of the big three. You got to cut Social Security, Medicare / Medicaid, or the defense. There's no way around it. To be honest, the way if you want to talk, if you ever hear somebody talking about the deficit, if you want to take them seriously, they got to talk about what tax increases they're going to put on the rich. The bottom 50% don't have any money. The next 50 to 90th, they got a chunk. The 90th to 99th, they've got an even bigger chunk, and the top 1% have a big chunk. If you just tax these people, if you got 1% a year more out of this top 10% that have 100 trillion, if you got 1% of that a year, that's $1 trillion. That puts your deficit down to nothing. So just keep in mind when you hear people arguing about the deficit and what we're going to do, which tax increases on the rich are they for? And if that's the litmus test, if they're not talking about that, just ignore them. Be like, you're wasting my time, because that is where the action is. That's the real action. This is a pipe dream. You're not going to cut Social Security. You're not going to cut Medicare. Good luck. I mean, if you really have a conspiracy theory about Trump being a Russian agent, then maybe he will cut defense an awful lot. But we'll see. I don't know if the Republicans are going to let him do that. Well, maybe not. So you're just not going to see it on the spending side. As much as Republicans talk about cut, it's going to be marginal cuts in terms of the deficit. They can hurt you cutting a certain program. Like Karl mentioned, you can cut the SNAP benefits. You can cut food stamps, which Biden dramatically increased. You can cut that back if you want to cut that back and make people hungry. If Democrats can't capitalize that, I don't know what we can. but it's here. It's in the revenue is how you deal with the deficit, and it's in interest payments is really where realistically you can do something about it. So just keep that in mind. Are they talking about tax hikes on the rich? Are they talking about cutting the interest payments? If they're not, don't attach much weight to them. It's probably a really bad idea if they do it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. You're going to hear an unbelievable amount of bad ideas daily, sometimes multiple times daily from the Republicans. You're just going to shake your head, and that's the nature of it. That's why we can just turn that off and focus on what we're going to do, right? The stuff we can control. We can't control them, but we can control our strategy, our messaging. We can control all that. Let's control that. Plenty that Democrats can do. Yes, go for it.
Bula? Man, I probably butchered that. Please unmute.
Beulah.
No, I was going to say, I thought that, or have I been misled all these many years that working, that we're paying into Social Security and FICA and all of that kind of good stuff, that people saying this entitlement. Entitlements, didn't this come about? Didn't when it pushed from Social Security and Medicare?
You're cutting out a little bit, so I think though. Let me say this: the word entitlements alone is a Republican frame. Remember, I talked about how we tend to battle in Republican boxes that they create. We fight in their sandbox. Your Social Security is basically a forced savings program. You put money into it, and then when you retire, you get it back. And the way the program is designed is you cannot get more than you put in. In other words, since the program's inception, 3 trillion or so more dollars has come in than has been paid out. And now that we've got more people retiring in an aging country, fewer workers per retiree, that 3 trillion is going to get worked down. And then all we'll have left is going to be the money coming in every year versus the payouts. And that's why if you don't change anything, if the law doesn't change, Social Security payouts will get cut about 20% sometime in the early 2030s. And so you need legislation to add revenue to the program, or you cut the benefits. And the way Republicans have an advantage here, and that if they do nothing, the program will get cut automatically. It's built that way. It cannot go bankrupt. You will always get a Social Security payment based on those payroll taxes that are being paid. That amount will be 80% of what you would get otherwise after 2020, about early 2030s.
David, also Medicare, right?
Medicare is similar, but not exactly the same. Medicare is funded partially by general revenue. But you're right in that there's a certain, I forget which program it is, if it's A or B or C, I forget how they do that. But Medicare has general funds going in as well. Social Security doesn't.
Well, don't we have? But we do pay for our Social Security. We do have to pay that $179 each month before you get your check.
You may be talking about Medicare. Is that a Medicare premium?
No, there's a amount that comes out of your Social Security check before you even get it.
Is that the taxes? It's a tax on the Social Security?
I didn't know there'd be a tax. I thought it was $179 that they take out of your Social Security check before you get it. And then if you have to have parts C or D or A, B, C or whatever the letter is for health purposes, you pay an additional amount for that.
It's an optional amount for federal taxes.
It must be taxes. It's got to be income taxes on the Social Security. Is that 179 you're mentioning? It's not a special number. It may be your number. Other people may be paying more or less than that. It's taken out.
It's actually Medicare Part B.
Yeah.
Yeah. The part B of the Medicare. But I don't understand why I may be talking out of school, but didn't Bush borrow money from one of these entities is the reason why we're in the fix that we're in.
Okay, yeah, that's common. It's because it's a little complicated. It was not because of what Bush did. What happens is every administration has been, when that money comes in for Social Security, it's not put in a lockbox somewhere. It's not invested. The government can spend it. But what they do is they create this, there's a legal entity called the trust fund, and that entity has the power to grab whatever money's coming in and pay you. And it will cause the government to print that money if that's what it must do to give to you. So don't worry about what Bush did, or it's just it doesn't really matter that they raided it or that there's a lockbox. It's all of a fiction. The system is designed that every dollar that goes into it is going to go and get paid out eventually. And, that is the nature of it. It is not, whether it's in a lockbox or not, really doesn't make a real difference.
Well, I have just one more additional question, and I'll shut up. Well, I'm never going to shut up because, like our possible second in command, Mr. Tim Wall said, you shut up when you're dead. So I'm going to continue to speak out.
Christine can shut you up because she can mute you, so be nice.
Yeah, I'm talking about any place, even if I get muted.
Go ahead.
I talk to myself, don't answer myself. No, the other piece of this that I asked for, and I haven't had opportunity yet to look into it. How much money is being, because you hear people saying it, and I haven't did any fact checking on my part. How much money is being given to the individuals that come through the fence or through the gate or however they get here to the United States? When they come here, are they penniless?
A lot of them are penniless, and they're on the welfare systems. They can get into the welfare systems of the states. They're not getting Social Security or Medicare or that. It depends on the state, what the state will offer them. Hospitals will not refuse them emergency health care. If they have an emergency and they're in the emergency room, the hospital will take care of them. But keep this in mind. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that immigrants are worth $65,000 per household over the next decade. Immigrants are a gigantic wealth increaser for the United States. They do have local costs for governments that are caring for them when they first come across the border, but they are not a net drain on the United States. Immigrants make us much, much richer, which is a point that people don't understand. Yes, there are costs, but there are much larger benefits of immigrants that come here and work and pay taxes. And, they create jobs because they're buying stuff. Their spending is our income. That's how economies work. Your spending is my income. My spending is your income. Bring on the immigrants, makes us all richer. And keep that in mind. Just don't let Republican propaganda about local costs bother you.
Oh, I'm just asking the question for point of clarification, because whenever I speak to people, I want to know that I'm saying something that's easily fact checked if for the word of the day, this season. But the other piece of that is, are you all familiar with what the Chinese are doing in regards to bringing people over here in the California, San Francisco area and places like that, coming over here because the women are small, they don't look like they're pregnant. You're not supposed to travel after 7 months. And they come over here and they have their babies in places in California where they have their own little private hospitals. And down their child has dual citizenship. So they're trying to get to the front of the line to become.
Yeah, let's not go there. I mean, I'm sure there's some weird things that happen, but in the national scheme of things, that's not a big deal. What's happening is you're getting triggered by economic propaganda about immigrants, and you don't want to go there. Immigrants are a huge
I saw this. I saw this on 60 Minutes.
Don't go there. Don't let that stuff bother you. You will get much richer by having lots of immigrants come here. It's important that they do. I put it in the chat if I can, but if you look up Congressional Budget Office immigrants or immigrant surge, do that, CBO immigrant surge, you will see an article, a paper that they did on the gigantic positive impact of immigrants in the United States. And that's the most credible source there is. So when you hear these little outrageous things about, I don't like the fact that Chinese people come here to have a kid in my country, blah, 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 put that crap aside. That's just propaganda. Don't get angry about that stuff. We want the immigrants.
I'm not angry about it. I was just interested.
You remembered it. You remember it of all the things going on in the universe that got you to ask the question. Keep that in mind, and that is what the propaganda people want you to do. Don't do that. CBO, immigrant surge. Read it. You will feel much better about immigrants. You won't care about those little weird stories.
I care less. I could care less because everybody that's here is immigrants.
Yeah.
It's nobody everybody that's here is immigrants that are not of an indigenous.
Yeah. So don't worry about it. Just turn that Fox News stuff off when you hear it. It's baloney.
I don't look at Fox.
Or even if it's MSM. If it's MSM, still turn it off. That's just outrageous stuff for local fixing.
So we are going to move on to the next person. Mark, you had your hand up?
Yeah. Tom Hartman was on with Alex Lawson today talking about the Social Security stuff. Alex said that, the problem with Social Security that is Reagan started taxing Social Security. And the real problem is that we should raise the cap so that the billionaire class starts paying into the Social Security trust fund. And that would really solve the problem. And also, I heard that Trump was importing Russian women into the U.S. to have their babies here, so they could be citizens. That's a minor thing.
In one ear, out the other. Just laugh when you see that stuff and move on.
Yes,
but no. A real important point that you make about Social Security. One of the most progressive solutions about Social Security is to do exactly what you said. The Social Security tax is capped somewhere. I think it's 160,000 something, somewhere in there, 160 something. And people above that don't pay any more tax. You're maxed out at 160. So if you make 10 million a year, you pay the same amount into Social Security as a person that makes 160,000. And you also, though, get the same benefit. You don't get a bigger benefit because you make more. If you were to remove that cap and tax the 10 million, a heck of a lot more, tax it all that income all the way up to 10 million and not give them any more benefit. That covers about 70-ish% of the Social Security shortfall. So instead of cutting your benefits 20%, in the early 2030s, they might get cut 7 or 8%. You know,
They should
somewhere
pay
there.
their fair share. And
Well,
should
they
we
won't
stop?
think it's fair, right? Because they'll be like, oh, but I think it's fair, right?
David and Karl, do you think we should stop taxing Social Security like Reagan put on to us?
I'm good
No.
with it. No, Karl doesn't think so.
If you stop taxing Social Security, the trust funds get deleted faster.
That's true.
Well, raise the cap and it's going to raise more. But
Now, bear in mind also
my
that
gut reaction is no.
the tax on Social Security is progressive, though, right? It's like it's not a flat tax, right? I don't know, but I don't think it's flat. It's as you make more money, the tax rate goes up, right? I mean, it's a progressive tax, so that's good to that extent.
The first X dollars has a 0% tax rate.
Right.
After that, you're taxed on about a half of your Social Security benefits.
Yeah. But you're right, Mark, that is an option. And it's one of those things that would be a nice working class option that's easy for them to understand, right? That's one thing that Trump does well. He says, I'm not going to tax you on this. And if you took that away and said no tax on Social Security benefits, that's that's a nice appeal if you got to win some voters over. But then you got to realize that you got to have another offset. You got to raise another tax on it.
Well, and
Trump won't say that.
He'd like to make money off it too.
Well, yeah. He might want to privatize it like Bush wanted to, but we're not going to do that. Let's go on to the next section. One of the things that is always fun about this stuff is the consumer sentiment. And it's very political. So what's happened, and you can barely see it here. So the Democrats have already started liking the economy less. Their sentiment has dropped 13 points, and Republicans are already 28 points happier. And this is not unusual in that Republicans hate the economy a lot more when a Democrat is in than vice versa. So sentiment has been really bad, and the media has amplified this statistic to no end. Reality is a little better than pre-pandemic, so the sentiment should be here, up at the top where that arrow is. Democrats were closer to it and then dropped off, and Republicans have always been in the basement, and now they're coming up a lot because they they're Trump fans. So right now, the numbers are converging around a number that is still much lower than it should be. Look at that. I mean, it's the Republicans are about as happy as they were in the middle of the pandemic. I mean, so when I see this number, and you hear about it a lot because the media amplifies it a lot, this is really it's only useful in pointing out how little people understand or how partisan they are, and not a real measure of what's actually happening in the economy. Here's where we show you in depth now, we go through some of these slides that we covered in brief at the beginning. So the hourly wages have grown almost 27% since the pandemic, right before the pandemic. And now the inflation's up about 22%. And then if you exclude food and energy, inflation's about 20%. This works out to about 4% more purchasing power in 2023, or actually today, than we had back before the pandemic, which was a time that Republicans loved. This is the actual dollars per hour, again, real, so adjusted for inflation. Right now, this $30.48 in October is the highest real wages ever in our history, going back to 1960, is it 74, I think, for this data, or no, older than that, 64. Back to 1964, with the exception of that spike over there during the pandemic, and that's a baloney number. That number was distorted because millions of low-wage people disproportionately lost their jobs, and that caused the average to spike. So disregard that. It's not a real number. But the number we have now, 30.48, way higher than 2020. And in fact, Biden, as I mentioned earlier, this average during the Biden years is the highest of any president. If you look at this graph going back all the way to 1964, it's sort of like a big U shape. It drops for many, many years into the mid 90s, going backwards from where we are now. And then it goes back up into the early 70s when it was actually nearly as high as it was before the pandemic. So we're all in record territory up in here if you ignore that weird spike there. Now, the media just talked about how the real wages had fallen from that spike down into 2022 and made everybody feel bad about the economy without explaining that A, that's a baloney number, and B, you're still better off than you were before the pandemic. So that's I think of the media's mistreatment and mistakes that they made. This is a great chart. If I would sit them down and walk them through this chart and say, guys, you can't just talk about a decline from a bad number. And they know it was bad. I followed these guys on the economics reporters on Twitter. They know this number was baloney, but they still talked about the decline anyway, instead of saying we're better off than we were in 2020. So there's a lot we can do as Democrats to outreach to these media people to say, you guys have got to do better. This shows the net worth in different groups back in 2019. So these are the numbers of how much net worth by group and the total. And that's everything's real, adjusted for inflation, and where those numbers are in 2024. So we've gotten a lot richer, $20 trillion richer over there on the right, 15% increase. And the bottom 50% had a big percentage increase, but we still have very little share of the total. We only have 2.5% in the bottom 50% of the total. The 50th to 90th has 31, the 90th to 99th has 37, and then the top 1% has 30% of the net worth. And net worth is like is your assets minus your liabilities. So it's what you're worth, your equity, like your equity in your home, how much your home price is over the mortgage that you owe. This is your net worth, your assets minus your liabilities. So it's gone up tremendously, but the bottom 50% is still capturing a small chunk of that. And that's part of what progressive policy is for, is theoretically you tax the rich more and you buy stuff for the people in the bottom 50%, whether it's healthcare, education, better retirement. You know, that's what progressives want to do. This is the bottom 50% households. Their net worth is up 56% in real terms now versus before the pandemic. 36,000 or 37,000 a household before, peaked at 61. Now it's at 57. So still much richer than before the pandemic, and we got the richest ever under Biden, and we should have bragged about it. Here is the 50th to 90th group. So much more well-to-do. These people are nearly millionaires on average for that group. So 894,000 versus 737 before the pandemic. So let's see, a few more and then we'll be done and we can open it up for a wider discussion. Although we've been doing that pretty good tonight as it is. So regardless of how you slice it, the GDP growth, so that big, you know, how big is the economy, how much income and production in the economy, has grown a little bit faster under Biden than Trump before the pandemic. So regardless of when you measure Biden, it's pretty consistent around 3%. Still, and then Trump's full term, the economy in terms of GDP had recovered. By the time Trump left office, it had gotten back to the pre-pandemic peak. So he had a 2% growth or so on average during his administration. So Biden, good growth story for him. When you look at us against the world, the US has faster growth and about typical inflation for the rest of the developed world, pre-pandemic to after. So no matter how many times you say this to people, they didn't want to hear it. They just wanted to hear that prices were up, and that was true. But the US was not that far out in terms of inflation against the rest of the world. We were, though, growing. We grew much faster, in part because we ran much larger deficits. That was a big part of why we put a lot more money into people's pockets and did more to help dig ourselves out, and it worked. We also brought in a tremendous number of immigrants. We brought in a lot, and that helped us a great deal in terms of all those job openings we talked about before. We filled them with immigrants, and that got us on the fast track to recovery. This is inflation. So for the past 4 months, it's inflation versus the prior month. So how much more expensive was a basket of goods relative to last month? In October, stuff was 0.2% more expensive than September. And it's been like that for the last 4 months. And if you annualize that, so you multiply by approximately 12, you get 2.4. And that is a reasonable inflation that's very close to the Fed target and is historically pretty low, and actually in recent history, not so low, but in the history of the US, inflation is more like 4-5%. This is pretty good, pretty low inflation historically, and close to that Fed target of 2% that they're after. This is the inflation versus a year ago. So this is how much more expensive stuff was relative to a year ago. And as we said, this inflation problem has mostly been solved. It's about 2.6%, 3.3% if you exclude food and energy. And that is mostly driven by rent and housing prices are what is, or what they call the ownership, owner equivalent rent, which to me is a baloney number, but bear with me, it's just mostly rent that's in that number. This is the detail by category. So on the right-hand side, you've got 12 months, and then each of these other columns shows versus the prior month, and you can pick your favorite item and see what's going on. The big one is here, shelter. These do not show you the weighting of the thing. Shelter weighs very heavily in the inflation weighting because that's a giant expense that you have every month. So that is really what's driving this. So I highlighted it in red. The energy prices, the gas, they're all looking pretty good. Gas prices are 12% lower than they were a year ago. And this just shows kind of an interesting phenomenon how over time, as we've gone through the pandemic, different sectors had different rates of inflation. So like right at the beginning, we were all locked in our homes, so we just bought stuff on Amazon. And so goods prices inflated very quickly. And there were also pandemic supply disruptions. Places were shut down and weren't producing. So you had goods prices jump first, then food for a while. And housing has been pretty consistent for the last couple of years as a high contributor, that dark blue. And then energy originally was adding, that's that green stuff at the top. That was gas prices and other stuff. As we recovered and started driving again, those gas prices went up. We also had the invasion of Ukraine, which added about 75 cents a gallon for a while. So this is a bit of the pandemic recovery plus Putin, the Putin premium. And then down here is food. So all those people that are upset about gas prices, rest assured, Putin was happy to help in that and get his boy elected. And all those Republicans, I'd like to say, you fell for it, didn't you? So what can we do? We talked earlier about some slides on strategy. You could write the Democratic National Committee. When you write your senators, interestingly enough, if you're talking about the Democratic Party and how to you don't write to them at their main address. When you send them an email and say, I want the Democrats to do X, Y, and Z, they'll send you a letter back that says, this isn't the right address because I'm not supposed to do this stuff on my day job as a senator or House of Rep guy. You got to go and talk to my campaign, my campaign office, and they'll give you that. So either way, you'll find it, or you can just look it up directly, but you can write the DNC, give them your best ideas for what you think they should do. And, you'd be amazed at how many people just don't do stuff like that. So you have the copy of this presentation. You can certainly email them as well. They've got a nice email form that you can use. And you've got some ideas that we've given you at the beginning of this presentation about mission statement and how to make arguments on particular issues and not getting caught in that Republican box and getting the media on your side. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do while we're out of power. These are some additional sources you can go to that'll help you with understanding kind of what's happening. So there's some major media stuff like Biden and Trump compared by WAPO, and you can see when you get the hang of the presentation that Karl and I do, you'll be able to see just how good a job they did on some measures and how they just did a horrible job comparing things on other measures. And you'll see, the New York Times did an article on how bad Republicans are for the economy. There is a presidential, if you're on Twitter, you can see some Twitter items on there that you can find. You can look me up as David Doney on Twitter. I'm David Charts. And I just signed up for another one. What's it called? Blue something? What's the other online?
Blue Sky.
Blue Sky. I just signed up on there as well. David Dash Charts, although I haven't put most of my stuff out there yet. It's like just this week I signed up on there. But that place is starting to grow very quickly too. So if you're sick of Twitter, you can go over there. But we've got some sources here. And there's actually a Wikipedia article on how much better the economy does under Democrats. And you can get a dozen sources from there. And you can see it. And that article has been developing nicely. There's a lot of people editing it now. And it's got some really good information. But if you don't believe Wikipedia, fine. Go to the sources. They're right there. So I think that officially ends our prepared remarks. Well, thank you all for attending. This has been the monthly session of the Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action Fiscal and Economics Group. Thank you for all that attended and your great questions and feedback.